All right, I guess it is. I guess it's 10 o'clock. So let us get going for today. Okay. All right. So what is it? Week four? Week four of the semester already? Isn't that crazy? By the end of this week, we'll be a month in. So that is completely insane. Okay. So what are we talking about today? So we're going to keep going with our discussion of how religion works. We've been kind of working through it a little bit. So hopefully, I think we've got, where were we? We got 4 of them done. So I think we got 5, or I guess 6, if you include 5 as a number. 6 social mechanisms, or causal mechanisms, that allows religion to kind of spread its influence in society. So once we are done that, we're going to move into theories of religion. So things get fun from here on in. Okay, so before I get started, it's a good time to check in. Any questions or anything you want to ask before I jump into the content for today? All right, it's too early and it's Monday. Okay, so we ended off Friday's class talking about, so obviously we spent a long time on causal mechanism number 3, right? Contextual effects. This idea that Smith has that religion, one of the ways that religion sort of spreads its influence is, or sometimes its influence declines, is through contextual effects, right? Basically, if you move into an area that's more religious, you will become more religious. If you move into an area that is less religious, you'll become less religious, right? So you kind of move along with the general kind of energy of that place. And we ended off talking about causal mechanism number 4, social service programs, something I think is quite familiar to us in general. This idea that obviously religious groups do a bunch of work in society, right? Charitable work, collecting money, collecting goods, providing services for people in the world, right? And I talked about the mustard seed. The one I forgot was Hope Mission. Hope Mission was the other religiously funded kind of shelter in Edmonton, right? And these exist, all over the world. All religions kind of have their own version of these things. Well, not all religions, but many religions have their own version of these sorts of things. So we see it pretty widespread, and it generates a lot of value for communities in the sense of, religious communities providing services that would otherwise be very expensive for the state at its various levels to replicate. Okay. So this one is probably a little bit less concrete in a sense. And this is causal mechanism 5, generating social capital. So social capital itself is a very sort of abstract concept. You can kind of, was that a hand up or just, oh, you're just stretching. Okay, sorry. My bad, I'm sorry. Questions already. So social capital essentially, often comes down to something like the idea it's who you know, right? It's not what you know, it's who you know. So when you leave this, the hallowed halls of the University of Alberta and you're looking for your first job, right? You're looking for that connection to get you into some kind of career, right? Sometimes it's helpful to know somebody, right? So somebody who works at a, accounting firm or, an engineering firm or whatever industry it is that you kind of want to work in, that personal connection can get you in the door, right? That's social capital. So basically, social capital is a series of social relationships of trust and reciprocity that's generally generated within communities, right? Now, Smith splits this into 2 kinds of categories, right? Bonding and bridging kind of relationships. So bonding relationships are those that create solidarity within a group or between groups, right? So you could have, within a group, all of the people in your community happen to come together, say, for a potluck, right? And that lets you get to know each other and lets you build trust, gets to know other people in the community. So it builds a kind of solidarity. This is my group. These are the people within it, and these are the people that I can turn to for help. Between groups, right, you could have social capital between groups as well, right? Two different religious congregations, say, working on, for our context here, working on a shared kind of political or social project could build, a kind of bond between these two groups, being like, okay, we are all on the same side. We can work together. We can trust each other. And then bridging, right, would be building relational ties that between groups that differ in significant ways, right? Again, this could be, different kinds of classes, neighborhoods, racial and ethnic groups, right? So you can see sometimes, especially in kind of groups with membership that's racially mixed, right? It can build kind of bonds of trust, bonds of solidarity across kind of racial and ethnic lines if they're all in a community together, or their communities are working together on, towards shared goals. So these are the two kinds of social capital that Smith kind of wants to talk about. Now, social capital, like I said, is this really weird concept in the sense that it's very abstract. It's like there's not a great way to measure someone's social capital, but it certainly exists. And one of the things that we know, it enhances individual lives. When we talk about youth and religion towards the end of the course, we'll see this. I can put it to you in numbers a little bit, because there are some definite benefits that for young people that are religious in hanging out in religious communities, and one is that it generates a good amount of social capital. So in terms of individual lives, right, and this is especially true for young people, social capital gives you access to a lot of adults or other people in communities that can help you in significant ways. So it's generally good. It helps things like greater senses of belonging, less loneliness, less anxiety, poverty rates decline, and things like, educational attainment. People with high social capital, for instance, tend to have better educational and career attainment. They commit fewer crimes. They use less drugs. They drink less. They're in better physical health. They work together on shared social goals. All of these sorts of things, right? They're more civically engaged because they tend to come together with their community to, either meet social challenges or to, engage in political advocacy, for example. So lots of things. There's more social capital obviously means stronger communities because there's more people doing more things, and they're able to mobilize. If you know a lot of people within a community, you're more able to mobilize towards shared goals, right? So you might be able to, I don't know, if you want to do your feed the hungry campaign, or get 10,000 coats for children, or school supplies or something for children that don't have any, you'd be able to kind of push that through these social networks, right? So it has a lot of benefits. Generally, people with higher social capital are happier, healthier, more engaged, better educated, and are doing better in their careers. So all those things are good. Now, this is the bottom thing is a little bit of a nugget. And I'll talk about this again later in the course, I'm sure. For whatever reason, and it's probably because of the shared commitments to particular religious beliefs, right, to accessing superhuman powers, religious communities tend to be really good at generating social capital, right? And it's like I said, it's probably those shared commitments that people have within communities that they want to help each other, they trust each other within those communities. So Robert Putnam, so he's a pretty famous sociologist, and he's most famous for writing a book called Bowling Alone, right? This is a very famous book, written in the beginning of the 2000s. So some of it is in need of updating, but it's a really interesting book. Now, the whole kind of premise of Bowling Alone was that the atomization of society, and Putnam here was really particularly critical of, and this will sound funny, cable television, right? That cable television and the fact that you could go home and watch whatever you wanted on TV allowed so many people to just kind of stay home, not interact with each other, and it had a detrimental effect on a lot of the organizations that used to get people together to kind of entertain them, right? The more people have been able to be entertained at home, the more things like bowling leagues, which a huge number of Americans in this case used to participate in, the more those have sort of hollowed out. And that's true for religious organizations as well. I mean, there's a pretty strong argument to be made also that, generally speaking, this is not related to social capital, but I'll tell you anyway because it's a funny little tidbit. Across all age categories, people are having less sex than ever before in history, like across the board, married, unmarried, all of it. I can show you graphs, but I won't. I have them in a different class. If you take sociology of youth, I actually have the graphs in there. And a lot of people think that this is related to things like Netflix, right? That at least some aspect of getting together to go bowling or having sex or, drinking has to do with being bored and needing to find something to do. And as we've been more entertained at home, a lot of this civic life has kind of done a kind of like a downward slope. Yeah, please.
So it's like, for example, the bowling league, maybe someone was never really interested in this type of thing to do. So maybe it's not like, oh, like this is making people socialize less, but people never wanted to socialize, but they had no choice. So now they're doing this.
I think we're saying the same thing. Yeah, I think we're saying the same thing. Yeah, I mean, boredom will make you go out of your house and bowl, even though you think bowling's kind of dumb, right? So, no, it's all good. It's all good. No worries. Yeah, but I think you've got it. We're saying the same thing. But yeah, but it used to be people would be more civically engaged and more engaged in groups because there was less to do at home. Yeah, please.
Wouldn't you say this concept of social capital is not unique to religion? It could be true for any community, right? Cultural, language-based, geographical.
Definitely, yeah. Religions are like, and here, this is kind of goes to this last point. One of the things that Putnam says in Bowling Alone is half of associational membership in America is generated by churches. So about half of social capital is generated in religious communities, despite the fact that fewer than half of Americans say attend religious services on a weekly basis. So it seems uniquely, maybe not uniquely, but it seems good like religious communities seem good at generating social capital. But you can also get social capital from the Boy Scouts, from the bowling league, from sports, Edmonton Sports and Social Club. These are all whatever it happens to be, anywhere that you're meeting with people, getting together with shared purpose, learning to trust them, you're going to generate social capital. It's just that religions seem really good at generating social capital, probably because, how to put this? If you're showing up to a religious congregation, you probably believe in whatever religion that is, which means you're unlikely to go anywhere. So you're more likely to want to just build bonds within those communities. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah. But yeah, it's not, social capital is not unique to religion, for sure. Okay. What's that? Oh, Putnam would hate, he's still alive. He does hate TikTok. And yeah, like TikTok, Facebook, Netflix, right? All of these things, video games, Fortnite, whatever it is, all of this has enhanced these problems to a tremendous degree. Yeah, please.
I'm using just like the Bowling Alone book was kind of based on how social capital is decreasing.
Yes.
Even like within the churches as well.
Yeah, everything's decreased, right? There's less being generated. Religions have been more resistant to it, right? Because people are more likely to continue being religious than, say, bowling, right? As the distractions have kind of increased. So now they're generating a ton of associational membership or social capital. Yeah, religions seem better than a lot of other social institutions at generating it and continuing to generate it. So if we think of, religions, potentially spreading their influence through social capitals, through these close social ties. That's one of the ways they do it, and they seem relatively good at it compared to, say, a lot of less identity-based kind of ways of grounding things. Yeah, please.
Would you also argue that there's a possibility that the social capital is made online nowadays due to the ease of access and availability, and social capital, and there's a type of social capital that's made online instead of in person?
So, okay, we're straying a little bit beyond what I want to talk about. I'll answer your question. Sherry Turkle's done some work on this in her book, Reclaiming Conversation. Is it Reclaiming Conversation? Or Alone Together? There are two books on roughly the same topic. It's either Reclaiming Conversation or Alone Together. But talking about the kind of ties generated online. So she categorizes kind of ties in two ways. You can either have what are called strong ties or weak ties. And strong ties are those that tend to allow for a lot of social action, right? Especially things that are complicated, difficult, might get you in trouble, and where you suspect that's, you're going to need people to support you financially, legally, in all these sorts of ways. In-person ties tend to be much better at generating strong ties. What you tend to find online is relatively weak ties, right? People who have loose associations that tend to break down much more easily and generate much less concrete social action, right? You can get people online to do little things like maybe low difficulty sorts of things, like donate to a cause, repost a hashtag, change their profile picture on Twitter X to a black square, for instance. Getting them to actually do longer term, much more committed things tends to be things that are only done in these kind of strong ties, in-person communities of people who know each other much better, right? Does that make sense? Okay. But yeah, read Turkle on this, and she's a good person to look at there. Okay, other questions? I don't want to jump forward, but I'm afeared of falling too far behind the pace that I wanted to set. Okay, so cultural mechanism number 6 is what Smith calls religious institutions secularized. Okay, and basically here, what Smith will suggest is that there are a lot of institutions that we see in sort of secular society that essentially had a religious founding and probably were religiously kind of oriented for a very long time, but that in the last maybe 50 to 60 years or less have seen a lot of those religious kind of ties break down, right? So they are now secular, but they owe their existence to religious reasons. And so a lot of the things that they do, right, education, community outreach, and these sorts of things, they still do those things. They used to do them for religious reasons. They were established and built by religious people for religious motivations, but today they're essentially secular, right? So they continue to kind of affect the world in a sort of, I don't want to say in a religious way, because that's not what Smith's saying. They continue to affect the world a lot of times in keeping with that initial mission that they had, even though essentially that religious kind of motivation has been lost, right? So their existence and their influence today are partly religious effects. The religious part is way in the past, but the effect kind of carries through into the future. And you can think of a million organizations like this. I think I talked last time about the YMCA, right? The Young Men's Christian Association. Now it's basically just a series of gyms. It doesn't really have a religious core any longer, but the fact that there are YMCAs is because, it was initially, for religious reasons. Essentially all of the older universities in the world, right? So if we think of, Cambridge, Oxford, these were founded for religious reasons, right? And they were run by the Catholic Church. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, were all founded by different religious congregations in the United States, at least in part to support the mission of training clergy, right? Each of these, like Princeton has the Princeton Theological Seminary, Harvard has Harvard Divinity School, it's still there, and Yale has one as well, but I can't, maybe it's Yale Divinity School as well, but I can't remember. So all of these, had kind of religious reasons for their founding. Now today, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Cambridge, and Oxford are all very much secular institutions. But the fact that they exist and that they continue to educate people is owed at least in part to their religious founding for religious reasons. Yeah, please.
How does that transition happen from religious institutions to secular?
Yeah, there's a lot of different paths, right? At least in some part, what happened to, say, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton is that the religious congregations that they were associated with, right, the religious bodies, they themselves went into kind of decline, right? So they were no longer able to, say, fund Princeton. Like I think Presbyterian is Princeton. So as, there were fewer and fewer Presbyterians, and we'll talk about that when we get to like the Churching of America. It's an interesting process. As they were less able to support those things, those institutions wanting to continue their existence found other ways of supporting themselves, detached from those religious roots, and then sort of moved into the secular space. There was also, starting from really probably the 1960s, a strong movement of all of these, just universities in general kind of drifting away from religious kind of roots, right? And it's only almost at this point, I want to say there's not that many religious universities left. There's like University of Notre Dame, Baylor, and a bunch of smaller places. But basically, yeah, as the kind of religious impetus kind of fades and some of those denominations fade, these institutions are huge and want to keep going. So they attach themselves to a more secular way of being. And as society secularized, they themselves became a little bit more secular. The Red Cross, the Red Cross would be another example. As you had the founding of the United Nations, a lot of the Red Cross's mission was taken over by a secular kind of organization that continued to work with it, but it got pulled off of those kind of religious roots. I don't know what happened to the YMCA, to be honest, but I just know they're not very religious anymore. Yeah, you have a question.
Well, I was just going to say the YMCA is a good example because it's actually it's not even, a lot of people think it's just like gym and stuff like that, but if you actually look at their programs, they have so many programs that are still related to helping the poor and youth and there's so many programs that I think oh wow, I'd never think that they'd have that, but they do.
Right. Yeah, but they're not religious. They're funded through donations and membership fees, right? Not by a religious body now. So yeah.
Yeah, but they still do the same stuff.
Yeah, that social outreach mission that they used to do is still being kind of carried forward. So yeah, the YWCA still operates a lot of women's shelters, right? So that's the kind of women's equivalent. And that was based on a kind of Christian impetus to help women who were being abused still run, but again, the religious roots are long past. So yeah, please. Well, the Red Cross kind of attached itself to the United Nations and stopped being kind of an explicitly religious mission, right? So it still has, it's obviously, its symbol is a cross, right? Which tells you something, right, about its religious foundations. But yeah, now it's essentially a completely secular kind of thing. Governments got involved too, because it used to be the Red Cross that collected blood, right? Like Canadian Blood Service, or is it Canadian Blood Service? It used to be the Red Cross, right? Over just by the hospital there. It used to be a Red Cross building until there was a tainted blood scandal, and then it was completely taken over by the state. But in a lot of places in the US, it's still the Red Cross that takes care of blood donation. So yeah, weird stuff, right? To help people who are needing blood, I guess. Okay, other questions? What else would you need blood for? Vampires? I don't know. We're good? Okay. You guys are fun. I like you. You ask lots of questions. It's awesome. All right. So again, this one is a little bit, it's like that past effect thing again, right? And Smith calls this the secular transposition of religious dispositions and practices. And if you ever want a tongue twister for your Friday night games night, attempt to say this really, really quickly, because it is not easy. Okay, so essentially this is the idea that religious ideas and behaviors somewhat get transposed into a non-religious context. And it's kind of related to one of the other causal mechanisms, I think the last one that Smith talks about, which is it's deep culture and invisible religion. So how am I doing for time? I'm doing okay. But this is the idea, right, that there are these religious ideas that are very much kind of, in a lot of ways, deep within a society, right? The West, for whatever you think of religion and the fact that we're quite secular in a lot of ways now, it was until very recently a majority Christian civilization, right? And so a lot of the ideas that are kind of core to Western ways of thinking are often kind of locked into, they have their origins in Christianity, right? At least to some extent, and they get sort of dispersed, changed, transformed, secularized in their own kind of interesting ways. Okay. So one of the examples that Smith gives, simple living, right? The idea that we should live very simply, that the closest we can be to our true selves is the one that's most detached from, say, material possessions, excessive consumption. In a lot of ways, this mirrors sort of, ascetic Christian ideas about, how do you really engage with the divine, right? So, I talked, I think, a little bit about the desert monks of early Christianity and the fact that they would go live in caves and eat only what they could forage and pray all the time. And Smith makes a case that this, the modern environmental movement or the hippie movements, right, where people want to live super simply, the hippie movements of the 60s and 70s, in a lot of ways mirror this kind of simple living Christian aesthetic or ascetic ideas. And that basically, we have this, it's deeply kind of ingrained that this is a good way of life. And so people will emulate that even without necessarily making reference to the Christian. Yeah.
The hippie movement take inspiration from supporting Christmas. I guess it's not inspiration from more Eastern ideas like
in some cases, yes. In some cases, no. There's a big part of, say, what do they call them? The Jesus people. Like hippies who also were like super into like Jesus. They call them the Jesus people or the Jesus movement. So there's some of that. But essentially, like, some of it borrows from Eastern ideas. I think the case that's been made is that where they really were adopted, it aligns with kind of that idea that's in Christianity as well, that simple living is the way that you get closest to the divine, right? And in that case, right, it's transposed in like nature, right? Nature becomes almost the object of, I don't want to say worship, but I'll go with it because I don't have another word, away from that Christian ideal, but still the idea of living simply, right, and of detaching yourself from material possession is one that goes well back in the West as well. So that's the case that Smith makes. We got to dial him up and see what he says. Does that work?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go with that. All right. One of the other cases, he makes this one. Oh, what is it? I think it's called Divided by Faith. It's another book by Smith. I'll write it because it's interesting. Divided by Faith. In that book, Smith makes the case that contemporary evangelical Protestants end up recreating and reproducing the racialized structures of the United States, in the secular sphere, based on their kind of religious understanding that religious interactions need to be interpersonal, right? That basically how you affect someone's religiosity is by building a relationship with them, and that this mode of being is like, instead of changing, say, this is all over this book, it's an interesting book, instead of, say, being focused on structures of racism, they're focused on the interpersonal. So, like a typical evangelical response to racism will be, I'm friends with 5 black people, right? Or I get along really well with black people, so I don't need to worry about the structures because interpersonally I'm good, right? And that their kind of interaction with the world and then their political program that comes out of that is affected by this very core sort of religious motivation or religious understanding of the world and how we should interact with each other. Not worried about structures, but worried about the interpersonal. So you end up, sort of recreating the structures of racism because those are your religious convictions as well. I think that makes sense. All right. It's a really interesting book. Okay. Other ones, right? Last one, some of the kind of the attitudes, the beliefs, and some of the actions of abolitionists, of especially British evangelical abolitionists, so people who were working to abolish the slave trade, like William Wilberforce, get mirrored in contemporary anti-racist movements like BLM. A lot of the arguments end up being quite similar, though stripped, say, of their religious roots. And again, this is not as direct. This is like religion continuing to affect society at a very subtle level, because some of the ideas that we carry with us are deeply religious, even if we've long ago stepped away from that religion. Okay. Institutional legal codes. Okay, this one I think is pretty straightforward and simple, right? Legal codes are often influenced by religious traditions, even after those religions have lost some of their cultural power, right? So I think one of the, probably most straightforward examples is sexual morality around sex work, right? Sex work continues to be seen as criminalized, or as criminal, right? That selling sex is somehow illicit, right? That it's bad, that it's immoral, and it remains illegal, even though in the West we've gone to enforcing the consumption side, right? So you arrest the people buying sex work rather than the people offering sex work. But still, it's not like prostitution is widely legal in the West. Okay, so all of this, in a lot of ways, continues to be broadly shaped by a kind of Christian sexual morality, which has been in force for a long time, right? In a lot of other societies, prostitution has not been illegal. Certainly in Rome, right? If we go back to, pre-Christian Europe, in the Roman Empire, prostitution was widely practiced and very much legal. So it's only the coming of Christianity that made it sort of illegal, and we continue to be shaped by that. Yeah, please. Like you're thinking like the patriarchal elements? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I have anything. We definitely talk a big chunk about women and women's role in the rise of religion. In terms of, it's pretty deeply ingrained in both Judaism and Christianity that prostitution is, immoral for lots of reasons, right? Especially the kind of Jewish prescriptions against adultery, right? Which prostitution can't help but kind of violate because of what it is.
Obviously there's a double standard, but it just
Okay, I'm not. No, I'm. It's Monday morning, and I totally understand. It is an interesting point. I'm having a little trouble tracking what you're trying to ask, but maybe if you want to come chat after, we can talk about it a little bit. Only because I'm falling so horribly behind. Yeah, please.
Wouldn't you say like pro-life laws and maybe like legalization of gay marriages and these kind of stuff are also the same causal mechanization on the roots of this is not what the church prescribes, kind of seeps into institutions, legal codes, kind of stuff.
Like you're thinking opposition to gay marriage, or okay, yeah, that makes more sense. Okay, yeah, I mean, I think very much so, right? This is, I mean, in the sense that, say, marriage or any kind of legal like sexual partnership that's legitimized has always been thought of until very recently in the West as male-female, right? That in itself is very much kind of Christian or Judeo-Christian in its kind of origins. And yeah, pro-life laws are definitely, where people are, and I mean the abortion bans that were in force in like in the US until 1973, and in Canada, I want to say it was 86 with Morgentaler v. Crown. Those are very much, owing to these kind of Christian prescriptions against abortion, which again go back to Judaism and to antiquity. So does that answer your question? Okay, perfect. All right, where was I? Other questions? No, we're good. 35. Okay, I'm going to get through 2 more of these, and we're going to be done with this today, I swear. Okay, yeah, a lot of Anglo-American jurisprudence is predicated on what's called a natural law, right? Or natural law inspired theories of individual rights, which are broadly Christian in their framework, right? Even though, they're often phrased, say, like in the US Declaration of Independence, in kind of deist or kind of quasi-Christian terms, they're predicated on, philosophy that comes to us from, say, people like Thomas or St. Thomas Aquinas. And to a lesser extent, you might say Maimonides, which I'm not going to try to spell because I'm going to get that one wrong, who is a Jewish scholar in Spain when Spain was under Muslim rule. Okay, but things like this, right? So this is, the phrasing from the U.S. Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, right? So created equal, and that they are endowed by their creator, right? So whoever that is, with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What natural law sort of is predicated on is the idea that basically rights are pre-existing of the state, right? So essentially in a natural law framework, where do rights come from? They come from God or the creator, or however you want to frame it. And then the state recognizes these rights. I'm just going to write recog, recognizes, right? But that the rights themselves actually come from God, and they're only recognized by the state later. And that this underpins essentially, both, English documents like the Magna Carta and subsequent ways that rights have been conceived of in England, and then they're carried through to the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and everywhere the British Empire has come to sort of influence people. And again, it's at a pretty subtle level, right? It's not like explicitly Christian all the time, and it's now kind of detached from those Christian roots. But arguably, this whole kind of tradition of human rights is one that emerges in the West from sort of Christian roots or quasi-Christian roots, and it's hard to sustain without at least a minimalist theology of a creator that endows rights, right? Otherwise, it's just the state granting rights, and theoretically, they could be taken away rather easily. Okay. Sorry, I know you've mentioned this before. Will the readings on Canvas be tested? They're there as an enhancement, not, I'm not going to test anything that's in the readings that I didn't also talk about in class. Joan, very quickly, I'm almost there.
Pretty sure we don't use the rights given to you by freedom should also be taken away just briefly, the rights given to you by the state.
That is a philosophical argument. Perhaps best left to a different discipline altogether. I'm more talking about just how they are articulated in say something like, the Bill of Rights or the Declaration of Independence. They are articulated in this kind of natural law framework. I guess theoretically God could take away your rights, but again, that's maybe a philosophical discussion for a different venue. But it's a really searching question. But yeah, I mean, what would tend to happen is, say, and this would be the argument of, say, Aquinas or even someone like Jefferson, is that where rights are being denied, it's that the state is not recognizing those pre-existing rights and therefore violating some kind of moral order that exists beyond the state. I don't know if that helps, but that's the sort of way a natural rights argument has always been kind of articulated. That the state is violating your rights, those rights still exist whether the state recognizes them or not. And that's often how it's articulated even now. Outside of a religious context with something like gay rights, is like, if the state is not recognizing your right to, say, same-sex marriage, it's violating something fundamental to nature, right? Fundamental to that's pre-existing of the state that the state is violating in some way. Okay, I must move on because I must get through 2 more slides. All right, this one's easy too. Direct intervention by religious authorities, right? So in those cases where religious authorities step in, we will see actual effects in society, right? So yeah, religion can affect the world through direct intervention by religious leaders. So Gandhi's nonviolent confrontation with the British colonial authorities, right, was a form of this, right? Where basically he's confronting them and and moving India towards independence. Martin Luther King Jr.'s role in the U.S. civil rights movement, right? And I think I said it before, if you listen to the I Have a Dream speech, he's using broadly Christian themes and imagery. He is a churchman, right? He's the leader of a church. I can't remember. I think it's Ebenezer Church in Georgia, right? And he's using religious language and these religious interventions to bring about the end of segregation in the South. And the Black church, right, the African American church, plays a big role in supporting King and his allies. Arguably, right, you could make the case, and I'll show you a little clip where this is kind of articulated, that John Paul II, right, Pope John Paul II, that would be 2 popes ago, died in 2005, played a key role in bringing down communism, first in Poland, right, and then subsequently through Central and Eastern Europe, and may have played a fairly significant role in the collapse of the Soviet Union. Okay, play a little clip. This is, again, that same guy who was talking about the church window, Robert Barron, talking about when Pope John Paul visited Poland during communist rule.
If someone had told me when I was a kid in the 1970s that the Soviet Union and its communist empire would collapse with barely a shot being fired, and that one of the principal instigators would be the Pope of Rome, I would never have believed it. Yet that's precisely what happened. John Paul II came to this square, Victory Square, in the heart of Warsaw, and he celebrated Mass in front of hundreds of thousands of people. During the homily, the Pope spoke of God, he spoke of freedom, he spoke of human rights. And as he delivered the homily, the crowd began to chant, "We want God, we want God." The Pope continued and the chant went on, "We want God, we want God." Then it was picked up rhythmically by everybody in the square, "We want God, we want God." Perceptive people at the time knew that the Soviet control over Poland, the communist empire, was effectively finished. This move of John Paul II is one of the most remarkable examples in our time of provocative nonviolence.
All right, last one. All right, so this is, okay, so I played that clip from Tom Holland, right? Not Spider-Man Tom Holland. one day Tom Holland will no longer be famous and I won't have to make that distinction anymore. But non-Spider-Man Tom Holland, the British historian, this, in that clip about the influence of St. Paul, right, on a lot of things like human rights, international law, right? Basically, that's what is sort of meant by deep culture and invisible religion, right? There are these deeply held but often unacknowledged kind of categories, assumptions, beliefs, and institutions that drive events in ways, that sometimes it's difficult to appreciate, right? Notions of things like human rights, of, equality. Excuse me, fighting a cough. Okay, things like equality, right? That you could put to, I can't remember which passage it is in the Bible, but it'll come to me. It's in Galatians, I think. There's neither man nor woman, Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, but all are one in Christ. But I can't remember which. I think it's in Galatians, but I can't remember. It's not important. It is, but it isn't, right? So often these things can kind of operate at a very invisible level, right? And here, this is an example that I think both Holland and my favorite snarky philosopher, David Hart, or David Bentley Hart, will articulate, that in kind of contemporary culture, there's a sort of value and moral superiority that comes from being seen as a victim, right? That the victim somehow has a high moral standing, right? So for instance, like when we see someone like George Floyd being abused by the police and killed by the police, right? We see in that a sort of moral superiority, right? As the victim, he is in a morally superior position to those who are oppressing him, right? And this, Holland will make this case in his book Dominion, which is a great book, and you should all read it. It is slightly on the longish side, but you should read Holland's Dominion. It's really good. Sorry, now I lost my train of thought. But he makes this case, right, that in antiquity, right, in the Roman world, in the Greek world, there was no value to being a victim. The only person who got held up for kind of as morally valorous was actually the oppressor, right? It wasn't the million Gauls being slaughtered and the other million being enslaved by Julius Caesar that had moral standing. It was Caesar as the man who conquered them all. But there's an inversion, and both Hart and Holland call this the Christian Revolution, where because, and I don't want to linger on this too long, because Jesus was himself a victim, right? He's unjustly he's accused, tried, and convicted and sentenced to death unjustly. And then, of course, he turns out to be God in the end of the Christian story. Rises from the dead and all that fancy Christian jazz. He imparts to victims and the oppressed a sort of moral rectitude, a sort of moral standing, a moral standing. And yeah, like I said, both Holland and Hart make this point. I think it's a really interesting one. And so today, we now, much detached from the Christian story, we still see the victim as ultimately, in a sense, morally praiseworthy, as somehow superior to their abuser, right, to the person who is oppressing them, because oppression itself is sort of immoral, right? Okay, now what Smith will say is that we rarely kind of stop and think about this, right? Like, very few people would have said, yeah, George Floyd is kind of like Jesus, right? And yet that kind of, I'm glad you like that. It was not meant to be funny, but I'm glad you like that. But at the kind of core base level of a civilization, or a society, a lot of those ideas kind of continue to hold sway over us, even if we've potentially long forgotten where they came from or why they came to hold sway, right? And the average person isn't going to really probably have much of a sense of this. A few philosophers and historians might, but most people are just going to assume that the victim in most cases has a sort of moral standing because they are the victim in that particular example. And there's lots of other ones that you could talk about, right? And this is true, I'm using a lot of examples from the West, but this is true not just of the West. In other societies, a lot of the kind of religious assumptions will carry forward quite significantly, even if those religions fade away or become less prominent. All right, I didn't get to my next set of slides, but I did those ones, and I'm out of time. So we'll start on theories of religion on Wednesday. So we'll meet Marx and Durkheim and Weber and Freud, hopefully. All right, put that there.